No one intervened.
Hello, and welcome to another bonus minicast of Jacqui Just Chatters. I am your hostess, Jacqui Lents. The weather's mood swings of cold and warm have brought in a serious fog bank, and I decided to begin the day with a nice cup of raspberry-flavored hot chocolate. Not that I really needed much persuading to start a day like that. And the hot chocolate got my brain meandering as I sipped that chocolatey and fruity flavor. I drifted back to my teaching days, and more specifically, when I had an aide also named Jacqui, which actually was pretty unusual because I can count on one hand the number of students I had named Jacqui. It's not an unheard of name, just not a really common name actually. So aide Jacqui was regaling one day the delights of Tim Hortons hot chocolate. And she went on and on about how fantastic it was. And I had to admit that I had never tasted it. Well, she was aghast that I was so out of the loop, that I had never had this stuff. So the next morning before school started, she went over to Tim Hortons and she went to my classroom and dropped off a cup of hot chocolate for me to try. Well, her oohing and eyeing was well deserved. It was a humdinger of a cup of hot chocolate. It must have been maybe a week or so later that I asked if she was planning on doing another Timmy Ho's run in the morning the next day. And she said, well, sure, she could swing by and pick me up some hot chocolate. So I gave her money to pick us up both a cup. So the next day, she'd made her run, and she came by my room before first hour and dropped off the cup. Now, this stuff is warm, folks. I mean, it is hot, which worked out because in my classroom, I had a hard and fast rule. No food or drink besides water. None. I didn't want ants in my classroom, and kids are messy when it comes to food. And in general, I didn't eat or drink anything in front of my students because I felt if this was a rule that I was asking them to follow, I needed to follow it too. So I put the cup on my desk. I would drink my hot chocolate during my prep period, which was second hour, when there would be no students in the room. And it would be just the right temperature to drink after spending an hour cooling. And I can't help but think now of the torture it must have been with that smell of hot chocolate wafting from that cup in little bits during first hour. Oh my gosh, it must have driven them crazy. And this was a routine we did several times that winter because I would every so often give her money to go get us Tim Hortons hot chocolate. And yeah, that probably was pretty evil to my first hour. Sorry about that, guys. Did think about that. Oh, but I still think about Jacqui and our Timmy Ho runs anytime I drive by Tim Hortons or I stop by to get a Tim Hortons hot chocolate now. I'm also reminded about another incident with a warm beverage. Many of us have heard about the case of the woman who sued McDonald's because of the hot coffee. It has often been thrown about as an example of frivolous lawsuits. I referenced it a few times in my own classroom. I was instructed about the case in one of my classes at MSU while I was preparing to become a social studies teacher. It is a great tale about how things are often not what they seem, and we need to look closer before passing judgment on something. The lawsuit, folks, was not frivolous at all. Let's start at the beginning. The woman who was the plaintiff in the case was one Stella Liebeck or Liebeck, I'm not sure, I'm going with Liebeck. The 79-year-old woman spilled a cup of McDonald's coffee on her lap and was burned. And I mean literally burned, folks. She had third-degree burns over 16% of her body. This was through her clothes. In just 3 seconds, she was burned. That is how hot the coffee was. She was in the hospital for 8 days. She required skin grafts. Her recovery period took 2 years. Do you still think the lawsuit was frivolous? McDonald's knew their coffee was too hot. They knew it burned people because she was not their first burn victim. Other people had complained about being burned before. But people like me with my hot chocolate, remember, I would get it at the beginning of the day and I would drink it at second hour. Most people would get their coffee from McDonald's and not drink it right away, but go to their office or go to some other place and drink it later. So McDonald's makes the coffee so hot so that you can drink it later and it would still be warm. The bean counters at McDonald's figured a few legal problems here and there were not worth changing the temperature they kept their coffee at. The jury, upon hearing this information, they decided to give Stella a nearly $3 million payout. When she sued McDonald's, she'd only been asking to cover her medical expenses. The jury, however, wanted to make a statement to the company, though I don't know if it made quite the statement they wanted to make, because that multi-million-dollar settlement doesn't even make one day's revenue of coffee sales for McDonald's. But everyone has been using this case as an example of frivolous lawsuits. And in reality, it wasn't frivolous at all. Now, I've been guilty of passing judgment too quickly, of not doing due diligence and researching things. When I was teaching my government students about pork barrel spending, I was guilty of this. Pork barrel spending, if you don't know what this is when senators and representatives get funding for local projects to help them get votes and look good back home. So you have a bill and it's about construction. It's a road project. And all of a sudden you have all these things inside this bill is funding for things that have nothing to do with construction. It's sort of a I'll scratch yours if you scratch mine situation. So these bills would be full of all these odd little funding expenditures that had nothing to do with the main focus of the bill. And I showed my students example of these. One that got a lot of attention as we looked at the list of unusual things was tattoo removal. And I thought this was so ridiculous. My students thought this was ridiculous, and we would talk about this until one day I found out what that money was really going for. It was to help people get out of gangs. Many folks in gangs get tattoos so they can be identified as part of their gang, and they wear them for life. But what happens if you want out? Well, you still have to wear those markers. What was happening is some counties were putting aside money to remove tattoos from people who were trying to put their life in a new direction. They wanted to put their gang life behind them. Well, that money no longer seemed so frivolous. Now, you can still argue if you feel that the government should or should not be spending money to help people get out of gang life. However, it's not frivolous spending. It does have a very serious purpose. I guess it goes back to that cliche about walking in someone else's shoes and judging books. It's so much easier to make sweeping judgments It doesn't require homework, empathy, asking questions, any heavy thinking. But it certainly doesn't make us better people. Just something to think about as you get yourself a warm beverage. Thank you for listening and joining me. Remember, you can follow on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. My regular episodes come out every other Thursday. If you are enjoying these podcasts, I would be delighted if you shared with your friends, left a rating on Spotify, or a review on iTunes. I hope you will come back for my next episode. I wish you well.